On the 1st of May, 1995, I found myself in the wrong place at the wrong time, very nearly. On that day, in May, a public holiday across Europe, I was driving a small red car towards the Croatian coast. The sun was shining, the radio was on, and I was really looking forward to seeing the sparkling blue Adriatic Sea and exploring some of those gorgeous Croatian islands. But my journey was curtailed when I realised I was driving through a war zone. If I hadn't taken a wrong turning which delayed my journey by a few minutes, I would have been at the scene when the bomb dropped. As it was, I arrived there in time to feel the heat of the burning apartment block through the closed car windows and see people running fearfully and confused from their burning homes. This tiny glimpse of the effects of conflict had a huge impact on me. It set me on a career path, and it set me on a quest to try to understand why conflicts arise between cultures and nations. I'm still on that quest, but I came to one conclusion, which quite simplistically is that it's because of stories which are passed down through generations and instill fear. Now, fear is destructive. Fear prevents us from fulfilling our potential as individuals, as communities, as organisations and nations. We start talking about those people who are different to us, not only because of the languages they speak, but because their behaviours are different enough for us to feel uncomfortable. And it's normal to feel uncomfortable with what we're not familiar with. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, understanding cultures and being culturally fluent is one of the most interesting and useful things that we can possibly do and experience in life. It's useful for our careers. It's useful for when we travel and want to meet other people and for enjoyment of life in general. And it's very useful for business and international trade. Now, I imagine that many of you speak other languages. When we talk about cultural fluency, we need three key things: dialogue, awareness, and empathy. And the first of these is dialogue, and for dialogue, we need languages. But everybody speaks English, don't they? What percentage of the world's population do you think speak English as their first language? Put your hand up if you think more than 30% of the world's population speak English as their first language. Okay, quite a few. More than 10%? Yeah. The figure is actually around 7%. Only 7% of the world's population speak English as their first, as their native language. And another approximately 18% speak English as an additional language, as a second or other language. And so that makes just about 25% of the world's population who speak English. Now, many of you will have learned a language at school, maybe. If you were educated in the UK, it was probably French or German or another language. But how comfortable would you feel about striking up a conversation in that language you learned at school? Or going abroad and doing business and trading using that language? Or even buying from a website which is only in that language. The research which has been done across Europe shows that more than 80% of people across Europe, and remember that many people in Europe are learning English from around the age 7 at school. More than 80% would prefer to buy in their own language. So, this has implications for business. And the All-Party Parliamentary Interest Group for Modern Languages has defined that £48 billion worth of contracts are lost every year because of lack of language skills. And further research undertaken by the University of Surrey shows that 30% of small to medium-sized enterprises, SMEs or small businesses, lose business because of lack of language skills. In my work as an international trade advisor, I help companies to overcome language and cultural barriers so they can export and trade more easily. And these are all kinds of companies: engineering companies, manufacturing companies, education organizations, business services, life sciences, pretty much every sector. And they often ask me for help in recruiting speakers of foreign languages to help them with their sales and marketing. And the language which is most commonly requested is German. Speakers of German, fluent speakers of German with business and technical skills are like gold dust. And yet, since the mid-90s, there's been a steady decline in the numbers of young people taking GCSE and A-level German and French. So we have a language deficit in our economy. And the British Academy surveyed 600 employers, and they asked those employers, what do you think are the most important skills for employability for the future? And amongst them are a global mindset, intercultural skills, and languages. Now, I know it's not easy to learn a foreign language, particularly as you get older and you have less time, or unless you have a really strong motivation to do so. So let's not forget the millions of people across the world who learn English as an additional language, because those people enable us to make friends, to travel, and to do business. They're like our communication angels, because without them, many of us would be stumped. So I ask you to think differently about languages and their importance in our education system, for example, and perhaps in our own continuous learning. Because languages do open doors. They open the doors and windows to the world. And I believe they're every bit as important as science, technology, English, and maths. I'd like you to remember these words, which I take from African wisdom. Nelson Mandela said, "If you speak to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his own language, it goes to his heart." Now, I've spoken a lot so far about languages, and that's because languages define culture, and culture defines languages to a large extent. But if we're talking about cultural fluency, what does that actually mean? As well as being fluent in languages, cultural fluency is about awareness. It's about self-awareness, about why we think and behave in particular ways. And it's also about world awareness. And we can think about culture as an iceberg. Great big iceberg in a great big sea. And at the tip of the iceberg, the smaller part of the iceberg, are all the things that we can observe about culture. These are the things like languages, the kinds of clothes we wear, the kinds of homes we live in, how we meet and greet each other, and the kinds of foods we eat. These things are all visible or tangible things about culture. But a lot less obvious are the things below the surface, the big part of the iceberg, things that are much more difficult to see and define. And these are things like how we perceive time, how we make decisions, what we consider to be good or evil, and what's socially acceptable. So I'd like to take one of these things which I find particularly fascinating, and that is how we perceive time. Why do we perceive time differently in different cultures, and how does that affect our behaviours? So, why is it in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia, and lots of other Western cultures, we're so fixated on time? It's all about planning, punctuality, schedules, contracts. Time is money, because what happens now affects the future. We're very future-focused. We're always planning and ahead of ourselves. But in lots of different cultures, for example, the Middle East, Latin America, parts of Europe, Africa, parts of Asia, it's much more about the here and now. Now, the present moment is much more important. So what happens now is more important than what happens in the future. So many of you will have experienced when you've been abroad that things don't necessarily run to schedule. There's a much more laid-back and flexible approach to life. And as the Dalai Lama said, there are only 2 days in which nothing can be changed. One is yesterday, and the other is tomorrow. So how we perceive time is different, and when I'm helping companies with their exporting, they'll often say to me, "Sarah, why, when I was in the Middle East, was the phone going in the meeting that I had planned? Why did the meetings never run on time? I had to wait at least an hour for my counterpart to turn up. And why is it that people take phone calls during the meeting? It's really rude." But this is just through our own lens of expecting things to run to plan. In other cultures, what happens in the here and now, so dealing with an intervening event or somebody else's crisis, is much more important than what's been planned. And if we can understand that, it makes it easier to deal with. So there are lots of things in culture which are interesting, fascinating, perplexing, sometimes frustrating too. And I've experienced lots of these things on my travels. I spent quite a lot of time in different African countries, and I was always perplexed about why public transport never ran on time. So things like buses. So there was no schedule, but when the bus did arrive, it didn't leave until the bus was full. And I can kind of see the logic with that. And I lived in Slovenia for a few years too. And I was quite taken aback by the communication style, which is very direct compared to what we're used to in the UK. So I'd be asked very personal questions about how big my apartment was, how many square feet my apartment was, how much I paid for it, how much I earned. But there was always a lot of concern as well about what I was wearing, that I wasn't wearing clothes which were warm enough for the weather and that kind of thing. And I didn't understand at first, but now I do. That comes from a communitarian mindset of being concerned about the welfare about other people. It was born of concern and not just being nosy. So culture is fascinating, and we cannot talk about culture without talking as well about empathy. So empathy is all about putting yourself in the shoes of others. And Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Because cultural fluency is like a currency. The more of it we have, the richer we can become in our careers, as leaders, in our communities, in our life experiences, and in business and international trade. And if we all seek to understand before we seek to be understood, we can all build bridges between cultures. Hvala lepa, dankeschön, grazie, gracias, merci beaucoup, molto mes, благодаря, kozonom, sheshe, spasiba, arigato, shukran, shukriya, dhanyavad, asante, thank you.